Okay, welcome everyone to Free Kiwis. Today we're very happy to have our friend and colleague, Professor David Rozado of Otago Polytechnic, who's joining us. And David, you've done a ton of interesting work at Otago Polytechnic to do with word frequencies and word associations and sort of scraping lots of articles on the internet. So welcome to Free Kiwis, and I wonder if you could start off just by explaining, even in layman's terms, the kind of work that you do.
Yeah, so it falls within the realm of computational social science. So I use computational tools to analyze big bodies of text. So large corpora with millions and millions of documents or words.
Right. Okay. So actually, we're gonna go back to that, but I actually wanted to start out with this recent study that we were involved in. We were all involved in with Heterodox Academy, or we got some support from Heterodox Academy, but it was done in New Zealand. So this is the perceived freedom of expression at New Zealand University's paper. It's been published in the the journal called Social Sciences. And Michael and I actually did a previous podcast, a New Zealand Initiative podcast, where we kind of teased this, as the kids say. We sort of said, "There's this article. We're going to discuss it more." So this is it. We're going to discuss it more now. So it's good that we have David, another one of our co-authors here. So since we kind of co-authored this, I don't know if this is an interview so much as a kind of discussion of what we found. But yeah, so do you want to just outline the project? So what were we doing in this study? Why did we do it? And so on.
Yeah, I assume you can see my screen. You can see the chart.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, so this was basically a replication of a survey originally done in the United States by an instrument created by Heterodox Academy to evaluate how free or comfortable students feel to express their opinions in the classroom about a variety of topics, such as politics, religion, gender, etc. And in the US, the results show that there was a considerable proportion of students that didn't feel comfortable to express their opinions in class. So we decided to replicate that in the New Zealand context. New Zealand is a country with a different political system than the US. In the US, the political environment is very aggressive. There's a certain kind of nastiness that probably doesn't exist in New Zealand. And we wanted to see to what extent the results would replicate in New Zealand. And what we found was actually remarkably similar to the situation in the US. About 6 out of every 10 students feel uncomfortable to speak about at least one of these topics: religion, politics, gender, or sexual orientation, when it comes to a class discussion. And for example, 4 out of 10 students don't feel comfortable talking about politics in a class discussion, and about a third don't feel comfortable talking about religion, sexual orientation, or gender.
Yeah, one of the things that interested me about the findings actually was the extent to which the ways in which students reported feeling comfortable or not about the various topics depended on their demographics. And most interestingly, that the kinds of demographics that would normally be conceived of by certain progressive ideologies as privileged were actually less comfortable talking about a relevant dimension. So, for example, men reported being less comfortable than women to talk about gender, straight people less than gay to talk about sexual orientation, and so on. I found that a very interesting finding. And you've got some data.
The findings were multifaceted, right? So, for example, when we control for gender, turn out that women are more uncomfortable to speak in the classroom about politics or religion, but it is males that are more uncomfortable than women to talk in the classroom about gender, for example, or sexual orientation.
Well, hold on. Let's just slow down a little bit. So this is a really interesting finding by sex, but I guess we should just sort of walk everybody through these results. So can you just go back to the first graph? So these were 4 topics that we asked students about. And I'm not sure if we said yet that we did a version of Heterodox Academy's campus expression survey, and we tailored it to the New Zealand context. So New Zealand has slightly different minorities, for example, than in the States. So we asked about Maori students instead of African-American students. But we thought it would be useful to use pretty much the same questionnaires they used in the States, so we could compare our results. Our results would be more or less directly comparable. And so we asked them about these 4 topics. How comfortable would they be having a say in sharing their views on these topics: gender, politics, religion, and sexual orientation. And actually, David, just from this first graph to start with, actually, one interesting feature of this is that it seems like we started this study with the assumption that in New Zealand things would be slightly better than the States. But looking at that graph, it seems like the percentage of uncomfortable students is actually higher in New Zealand, right?
I mean, I think in general it's quite similar between both countries, and some differences are so minor that they are not statistically significant. I think the overall trend is that it's surprisingly similar, despite the US on the surface having like a very nasty like gridlock in the House of Representatives and the Senate, but
yes, I suppose it depends on how we see the influences on undergraduates and their propensity to feel uncomfortable. They may be less affected by the broader political environment and more affected by what they perceive to be the ideological constraints in the university.
Yeah. I mean, it's difficult to tease out like the specific reasons behind this, but we can for sure say that a significant proportion of students in New Zealand universities don't feel comfortable speaking up their opinions about these topics in a campus environment.
Okay, great. Let's sorry to back you up. Let's just continue to walk through these different results, because as Michael says, we did break it down by various demographic characteristics. So here's the picture. Well, let's talk about the picture by gender or by sex there. So yeah, do you want to say a bit more about those findings, David?
No, I think the main result here is that women are more uncomfortable than men to talk about politics or religion, and men are more uncomfortable to talk about gender. I think those are the main results.
Yeah, I think that's right. And one interesting thing here in this graph is that the pattern seems to be very similar for both countries on gender, on politics, and religion. So on gender, the men in both countries seem a little bit less comfortable than the women.
That isn't quite right. It's actually politics and religion that are most similar.
Yeah.
In both countries, women are less comfortable than men to talk about either of those topics. The gender thing, there's a split between the two countries. In the United States, men and women are about equally comfortable to talk about gender, whereas in New Zealand, men are much less comfortable than women.
Yeah, okay, that is a significant difference. But I guess even more interesting, if the differences are significant, is the final category there, sexual orientation. I was trying to make a contrast with that. Sorry, back to the gender one, David.
Yeah.
So yeah, just the no, I didn't mean the final graph. I meant the final column on this, or the final 2 columns on this graph. So it's interesting to me there that when it comes to sexual orientation in the US, the women are less comfortable. In New Zealand, it's the male students who are less comfortable talking about gender.
About sexual orientation.
About sexual orientation, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean the differences are relatively mild here. I mean the most striking thing to me about this figure is the politics and religion difference. So the uncomfort of women talking about these topics and the uncomfort of men talking about gender. Mm-hmm. That was quite striking.
In New Zealand specifically.
Yeah. Yes.
The latter. Yeah.
I'm talking about New Zealand because that was the focus of the paper.
Yeah.
And also, I thought it was interesting, like what we found for the political leanings of students. But even before we talk about this chart, I think it was quite surprising. Like when we ask students about their political orientation, the percentage of students who were right of center was very, very small.
Yes,
it was a vast majority of left-leaning students, and then there were like these substantial differences in how comfortable right-leaning and left-leaning students are to speak in the classroom about these topics, right? So right-leaning students are more uncomfortable than left-leaning students to talk about gender and sexuality.
Yeah, and my sense is that even though we only really compared the US data because we wanted to have really directly comparable information from the heterodox academies, campus expression survey. My sense is that there have been other surveys of this style in Canada and the UK, and they also find that it's people on the right who feel more inhibited on university campuses at this point in time.
They are a minority, right? Like they are a minority of faculty, they are a minority of students. So probably it's not too surprising. And then there was another surprising result. I think it was that when we controlled for the sexual orientation of the students, it was straight students who were more uncomfortable to talk about gender or to talk about politics or to talk about sexual orientation.
And in this case, it's not because they're a minority, because they're not a minority.
That's true. That's true.
So we might, I mean, again, this is speculation to a degree because we didn't collect any data on the reasons why they feel the way they do. But it seems that the common factor across these categories of discourse may have to do with what is perceived to be the dominant ideology of academic discourse.
I mean, there was a discrepancy in the there was this sort of paradoxical results in which we ask students, how do you feel that other groups feel
about
yes. Speaking in the classroom, right? And there was this interesting fact, which most students felt that straight students, I assume, can you see my mouse moving?
Yes.
Yeah.
So most students assume that the straight students are very comfortable speaking up their opinion in the classroom. That's the perception of most students. But then when you actually look at how straight students feel, this is not the case, at least for a few of these categories. And I think this discrepancy is very interesting because if a group of people is being perceived as very comfortable speaking their mind, but they actually are engaging in self-censorship because they are not comfortable, I mean, there's this risk of alienating this group of people.
That's absolutely right. And I would say that it is actually consonant with my speculation that it has to do with the perceived ideological tenor of academic discourse, because that discourse tends to hold straight people and men and white or Pākehā students as being privileged. And so therefore that will feed a perception that they would be more comfortable. Whereas if in fact they are less likely to be in step with that ideology and have views that are outside it, that would explain why they are in fact less comfortable.
Yeah, I suppose if you're playing devil's advocate, you could say what we found isn't necessarily that the straight people are less comfortable. They just perceive it that way. So they maybe it's or okay, they say they feel uncomfortable. Maybe that's just because they're all snowflakes. They're all less robust or something. Is that possible?
Well, I suppose anything's possible. There's no particular reason to think so.
I mean, it's very difficult to disentangle. I mean, the reasons behind these patterns. What we can say for sure is what we found, what the data says, and I think these are interesting and important results because, to a certain extent, they make us wonder whether this sort of environment that the students feel in the university is conducive to the stated goals of liberal education, right? Where you are supposed to question, receive knowledge, to have engaging critical thinking. And if there is this like substantial proportion of students that don't feel comfortable speaking their opinion in a classroom discussion, you have to wonder if the educational process is achieving its goals.
Oh, that's a good point, David. And I think that is the main takeaway from our study, that actually the university is to some extent failing as a venue for the free contest of ideas if we have students actually of any demographic category in significant proportions saying that they're not comfortable to discuss their ideas.
Yeah, I mean, especially what we're talking about here, of course, all public universities. So they're getting taxpayer money to serve the whole of the New Zealand public, right? And in the States, I mean, you could have a slightly different conversation because some of them are private. So you might say, well, maybe some universities in the States, you might expect religious universities to, make non-religious people less comfortable in class or whatever. But I think, you know, in New Zealand, these are all supposed to serve a full cross section of the New Zealand public. And to that extent, if, you know, we find, as we have found, that particular types of people are much less comfortable sharing their views in class, I think that should ring some alarm bells.
So
So we've got a few more categories we haven't looked at. I wonder, did we look at the breakdown by religion? And I think that was the last one.
we have very few very few religious students. Most students reported not being religious.
Yeah, and that was another contrast with the United States, right, where there was a much higher percentage
Absolutely.
of religious students.
Yeah, a fairly clear cultural difference between the two countries.
No. No. I didn't put that chart in the deck to keep it short.
Oh, no, no worries. Sorry. Yeah, that's anyway, that's another, people can look up the complete paper if they want to look at that one.
We'll put a link on the
Yeah,
podcast.
open access.
Yeah.
Great. Okay. So unless anyone wants to say anything more about that particular study, we can move on and talk about some of David's other really interesting research.
Sure, let's do that.
All right. So David, so the thing I started with, actually, I asked you just to sort of just an introductory question about kind of work that you tend to do nowadays, which is sort of, you know, finding these word frequencies and associations. So one of the projects that you've done is on prejudice denoting words in various fields. So I think the first one you did with this was in 47 leading US media websites, and then you did the same for the UK or something similar for the UK. And then you also did something for academic papers. So can you talk a little bit about your work on prejudice denoting words?
Yeah. Yeah, so basically, as I mentioned before, I use computational tools to analyze large data sets. One of the data sets that I've been working a lot with is a data set of news media, news and opinion articles over the last 50 years. So I think I've been the first one to report and to publish and to document a huge spike in news media in the number of references that they do to terms that signify prejudice. So I think this figure encapsulates this trend pretty well. So the x-axis here is time since the 1970s until 2019. The y-axis is the relative frequency, so number of mentions divided by the total number of words generated by the outlet in the year.
And the blue and red lines denote different newspapers, is that right?
The blue line is the time series of the New York Times, and the red one is the Washington Post, two of the most important newspapers in the United States. And what you can see is that there's post-2010, which is indicated here with the dark gray background, there's this exponential growth in the usage of terms that denote prejudice: racism, racist, sexist, misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, etc. And it's quite significant. So racist is up by over 600% in the New York Times. Misogyny is up by over 900% since 2010. White supremacy is up by over 4,000% in the New York Times, almost 6,000% in the Washington Post. So very, very substantial increases. And this is not circumscribed just to left-leaning newspapers like the New York Times and the Washington Post. It's all over the media. So for example, this is an analysis of 47 popular news media outlets, 27 million news articles, and you see the same trends.
Yes.
2010. A common reaction when people see these charts is to attribute this spike to Donald Trump, to all the controversy surrounding that presidency, etc. But I actually show in the paper that this trend started before Donald Trump. So if you look at this analysis here, Donald Trump announced his candidacy to the Republican Party nomination for the US presidency in mid-2015. But 1 year before that, in 2014, the usage of many of these words were were at record high up to that time. So for example, the usage of homophobia and homophobic in 2014 were at a record high. They have never been used as much in the previous year. The same for racism and racist. The same for sexism and sexist, with the exception of 2008, which was the year in which Hillary Clinton competed with Barack Obama for the nomination of the Democratic Party to the presidency of the US. So already in 2014, there was this spike was already noticeable. So I think I mean, obviously these processes are probably very complex and multifactorial, like the reasons why this is happening. But I think what was happening is that, I don't know if you probably can see in these previous graphs that in the 1990s, there was like a very mild wave of this sort of rhetoric in news media. And I think what happened is that post 2010, there was probably like a similar, relatively mild wave. And then with the election of Donald Trump and the polarization that happened with half of the population hating him and the other half liking him, that probably reinforced this trend. That's my opinion.
Yeah.
But obviously, it's very difficult to disentangle all these because probably all these trends are probably overdetermined. But I think that might be what is going on.
I mean, we might see Donald Trump as, you know, one cultural phenomenon, as it were, albeit quite a powerful one amongst many, and certainly his bid for the presidency and his ultimate success in gaining the presidency was part of a cultural process. I mean, we can see in other research, especially from the Pew Foundation, that the two sides of American politics have started to rate one another with more and more hostility over time, you know, well before Trump came on the scene. So it seems to be part of a larger trend, and he fits into that, and certainly the fact that he was himself pretty polarizing may well have driven it harder, but it was, as you say, already there.
I think it was like a reinforcer within a positive feedback loop, and also like further evidence that this was just not exclusively could be attributed exclusively to Trump is that this is also happening in other countries that don't have much to do with the United States. So, for example, this is a similar analysis that I did in the main newspaper in Spain, which is called El País. It's sort of like the New York Times. It's considered the newspaper of record in the country, is left-leaning, and you also see this increase over time in the usage of these terms.
Yeah.
So it's also happening in Spain, and it's also happening in the UK. So here you have an analysis of UK news media, The Guardian, The Times, The Telegraph, the BBC, etc. And you also see like these increases, and they started before Trump. So you see like the spikes in sex, like gender prejudice started like post 2010, but well before 2015.
I haven't studied the graphs in enough detail to see, but it looks as if the upward spike started at a very similar time in different countries.
Yes. Yes, something happened around 2010. I mean, it's easy to blame social media for everything. Perhaps they have a role. They are, as I mentioned before, very difficult to disentangle the process behind this. But we can speak to what the data says. And for example, another interesting pattern, I think, is, for example, here in the UK media, but you also see the same in the American news media. You see that, for example, left-leaning outlets here in blue, they tend to use this terminology more than right-leaning outlets. But the right-leaning outlets are also increasing their usage of this terminology. And there is an exception to this, which is the topic of anti-Semitism, where it's the exact reverse. Right-leaning news media mention anti-Semitism more than left-leaning news media.
Right. So in that case, I mean, it strikes me, just in terms of my own knowledge of UK politics, for example, that the idea that Jeremy Corbyn, for example, was anti-Semitic was used by the conservative right in the UK, justly or not. I mean, I think it had a certain amount of justice to it myself, but you know, that was part of the discourse that the right wingers in the UK sort of took up.
Yeah. And this, I mean, so far I've been showing charts that focus in these terms that signify prejudice, different types of prejudice, but similar phenomena are also happening for a different set of terms, and they are surprisingly correlated with each other. So, for example, when you look at terms that are often associated with social justice discourse, like diversity, equality, inclusiveness, fairness, etc., you see the same sort of upwards trends.
Not quite as pronounced as the words like sexism and racism and so on.
I mean, well, I mean, it depends which terms you choose. I mean, if you look at cultural appropriation, you know, like, I mean, the term was basically not used until 2010, and then the increase is huge.
And white privilege is a big, it comes out of nowhere. And also I noticed gender pronouns, that's sort of not even a thing and
hate
then it
speech,
becomes a thing.
etc. And
Yeah.
another set of terms that I think is very interesting and highly related to all these trends is terms that denote political extremism. So this is a different analysis, a different paper in which I look at American and UK news media and how often they mention terms that signify political extremism. And I use a symmetric set of terms to have a fair comparison. So far right, far left, radical right, radical left, extreme right, extreme left. The top row is American news media. The bottom row is British news media. And you see similar trends in the sense that post-2010, there's a spike in the usage of this terminology. But also another glaring trend is that the news media in general is much more likely to mention the far right than the far left. There's a few exceptions to this. So if I look more in detail, for example, to outlets such as Breitbart that are clearly right-wing, or the Daily Wire, they mention the far left in blue more than the far right. But in general, most news media mentions the far right more than the far left. And even newspapers that are supposedly to be slightly right of center, like the Wall Street Journal, they mention the far right more than the far left. And this was not always the case, because this is an analysis from 2000 to 2019. But for example, when you look at like further back in time, in the 1970s, the New York Times used to mention the far right similarly, in like a similar amount of times as to the far right. Like the mentions of far left and far right were pretty similar in the 1970s. And it's only in the 1980s where they decouple and they start to mention the far right way more than the far left.
Yeah, and the divergence coincides with the increase, in fact. So back in the 1970s, neither term was mentioned much, but to the extent that they were, it was quite equal. But then the term far right starts to take off, whereas the term far left shows a small spike much later, but it doesn't really increase to nearly the same degree.
But be careful, because the figure is misleading, because you are starting from different points. The increase is actually quite similar. It's just that they mention the far right much more. But for example, when you look at the New York Times from 2015 to 2019, they increased their mentions of far right by 260%, but they increased their mentions of far left by over 300%. You just don't see it because the scale is much smaller.
Oh, I see. It's from a lower base, you mean?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
These numbers are so small that the increase doesn't seem like much, but when you look at the percentual increase, it's actually huge.
I'm wondering if your research sheds any light on the contexts in which these words are used.
Yeah. We can talk about that later. I have a few slides about those techniques. The last thing I wanted to say about this analysis of news media is that all these trends are highly interconnected and related. So, for example, here I'm visualizing how the media mentions political extremism, words that denote prejudice in orange, and terms associated with social justice discourse in green. And I normalize here with something called min-max scaling. So you basically neutralize like the overall absolute frequency of words, but you do this normalization so you can see maximums and minima. And what you see is that all these terms start to spike post 2010, and they are like the time series are highly correlated with each other. So there's something that is driving this phenomena, and it's highly interconnected. Political extremism, words that signify prejudice, and words that are often associated with social justice discourse.
Okay, so that's fantastic. I mean, just the data that you've sort of drawn out there and made clear is just really fantastic, and it gives us a great sense of, well, one thing which is going on, but as you said, it's one thing to trace the frequency of these words, and another thing to suggest hypotheses as to why this is happening. So again, just
move to that if you want, we can move to that.
Yeah. So I was just going to suggest, though, I mean, so maybe you could look at these results, I suppose, and say, well, maybe this just reflects real world trends. I mean, maybe there has been an explosion in far right activity, especially on the internet, and maybe, the reason that all these social justice terms are increasing in frequency is that people have just been convinced that this is actually the right way of seeing things. And yes, our systems are racist and sexist, and everyone is realizing this at the same time, and it's reflecting, something real about the world.
I mean, without getting into the realm of speculation of like the sociological reasons behind this, I think again we can look at the data to sort of try to draw inspiration about the dynamics and the relationships between these trends. And I think a highly significant set of results associated to this analysis is another analysis that I did, but instead of news media content, of scientific and academic content. So looking at millions of academic articles that have been published over the last century, and looking at the same set of terms and comparing them to the media. And I think there's some interesting results there. So if you want, we can go there.
Certainly.
Okay, so this is a similar analysis looking at the same set of prejudice signifying words, but instead of news media, here we are looking at academic publishing. So things that are published in scientific and academic journals. And there's some very interesting patterns here. The first one is how often academic papers mention terms that signify ethnic or racial prejudice. So this chart very nicely illustrates that this has happened over 4 waves over the last almost century. So it started after World War II with a minor wave. There was a second large wave at the end of the 1960s. There was a third one in the so-called politically correct 1990s, beginning of 2000s, and we are just going through the last one, post-2010. And an important dynamic in this chart is that these are not blips that come and go. I mean, each new wave creates a new baseline, which is higher than the previous one. So I think that trend is important. Another important trend, for example, if you look at the anti-Semitism chart, you see that there's this huge spike like after the Second World War, but then interest in this topic doesn't increase much in the academic literature. This is in a like in very large contrast with news media, where if you recall these charts, there's a very substantial increase in mentions of anti-Semitism in news media, also of all the other types of prejudice. But in the academy, this is not the case. So this suggests that at least for the topic of anti-Semitism, there's a large decoupling between news media and the academy. Other interesting dynamics are, for example, sexual orientation prejudice. It rises during the 1980s, during the midst of the AIDS epidemic. And the gender prejudice is very interesting. I put here another graph that compares both the ethnic prejudice and the gender prejudice. So here in red, you can see the time series of prevalence of ethnic prejudice in the academic literature. And in green, you see the trends for gender prejudice. And what is interesting for me in this figure is that the concept of gender prejudice didn't exist basically in the academic literature prior to basically the 1970s. And it's sort of like the academics that popularize this notion, they look at the literature, the emerging literature on the topic of ethnic prejudice, and they mimic that in a way, just with a few years of latency. I don't know if it was the same academics or just other academics looking at this field, but this latency lag here, I think, is extremely interesting, of just a few years. And yeah, the same or very similar patterns also for terminology that is associated with social justice discourse, diversity, equity, inclusion. They are all rising in prevalence in the academic literature. And I think one of the most interesting takeaways of this work, comparing news media, the institution of news media and the academy, is that here you have like dozens of time series of different terms, etc. There's this method in data analysis, which is called factor analysis, to sort of summarize all these trends into an underlying pattern that captures most of the variance that we see in these charts. So when I did this for both the academic content and the news media content, I found that in academic content, which is the blue time series here, you see a gradual increase in the prevalence of this terminology over time since the 1980s. And then it accelerates post 2013 or something like that, but it has been relatively gradual. And in news media, which is the orange time series, it's a slightly different trend. It's much more stable over time and then took off dramatically post 2010.
But in both cases, you're saying there's a single factor or construct, if you will, that underlies all of these terminologies in both media and in academic literature.
Yeah, there's like a single factor that explains almost 60% of the variance of the analysis of all these terms that denote prejudice. And you see very similar results for the social justice associated terminology.
I might just add for the non-social scientists amongst our listeners that 60% of variance explained is very impressive.
Yeah, I mean, basically, I mean, these terms, like at different points in time, they have been growing, and the growth has been relatively gradual in comparison to news media. In news media, the prevalence of most of these terms was relatively stable for many decades, and then it exploded post 2010. And I mean, this is an interesting technique, method like factor analysis, where you can quantify the effect and all that, but this is pretty obvious when you just look at the data, right?
Yeah.
So you see that it's pretty stable over many decades, and then post 2010 it explodes. While in the academy, there's also these spikes, but it has been more gradual in general. Although there's also terms that probably were not used very much a few decades ago, and they also explode. But there is a difference here. So I don't know if you guys want to move into these other techniques of looking beyond frequencies like associations and machine learning models, or whether you want to talk about frequencies a bit more.
Well, I think we could actually move to some of the explanations that you were talking about, that you might have some views on that. And I'm also interested, as I said, in the contexts in which these words are used.
Okay, let's context. Okay, so yeah, all I've been talking about is basically frequency counts, right? How often, like normalized by actual volume produced by these institutions. There's more advanced techniques that can be used to analyze the data. One of them is called word embeddings. This is a technique that comes from machine learning. For people who are not into data science, I will summarize this technique as basically a way of representing words as arrays of numbers, where these numbers encapsulate the semantic and the syntactic connotations with which a word is used in a corpus of text. So you basically use a computer program, a machine learning model that scans a large corpus of text and measures the associations. So which words are near other words often in the text, and from there it can infer the meaning of words, the syntactic roles that they play, etc. So one of the results of this analysis is that words that tend to have like similar meaning in a corpus of text, like cat and kitten, they tend to be adjacent in vector space. And you can use these to measure common associations in a corpus of text, etc. So I did that for a large corpus of text gathered from universities' institutional web domains. So I look at the top 50 universities in the United States and a large amount of, like a large sample of their websites, their web pages, their web domains. And then I look at the context in which they used one of these words that I've been talking about that is highly correlated with the others, which is the concept of diversity. And the main results of that work was that the term diversity or diverse in the institutional web domains of American universities, it tends to be used near terms that denote demographic types of diversity that mostly has to do with external appearance or with immutable characteristics. So things such as sex, ethnicity, etc. They are the ones that are highly implied when these universities talk about diversities. And other types of diversity, like intellectual heterogeneity, so things such as political orientation, religious views, morality, they don't tend to often be associated as often as the other words with the terms
It's
diversity.
very interesting. Is it possible to simply explain what the dimensions of that space denote?
Oh, yeah. Oh, I mean, the vectors, they live in a 300-dimensional space, and this is a dimensionality reduction technique. It's called T-SNE, T-stochastic neighbor embeddings. It's sort of like it's sort of like
cluster analysis sort of thing?
It's PCA, it's similar to principal component analysis.
Okay.
Basically encapsulate what are the two main dimensions that capture most of the variance, and are still able to separate the data as best as possible.
So, David, if I can just make one point about that diversity thing that you found, that's very interesting to me, partly because it seems to me that a lot of the strongest and even oldest arguments for diversity, I'm thinking, for example, of the so-called summation argument in Aristotle, where he basically says, you know, there are situations where many different people can come together and produce a result that's better than a single mind. And he talks about sort of pot lunches in the ancient world. Anyway, a lot of those arguments for diversity, they are really thinking about intellectual and epistemic diversity, you know, diversity of ideas, diversity of viewpoints. So it's kind of interesting to me that universities, they're not so much stressing that, they're stressing other things.
Yeah, mostly is the diversity of ethnicity, of race, or of sex and gender. Those are the main ones. And obviously the argument is that this kind of diversity brings on its own intellectual heterogeneity because of the demographic background. But at best, that would just be a proxy, right? Like if you really want intellectual diversity, you could like look at that. So this technique can also be used to sort of detect prevalent associations. And when you look at associations, for example, of sentiment terms, I found that this measurement or instrument was highly correlated with human perceptions of bias in news media. So this gets a bit complicated methodologically, so I will not go into the details, but basically this is an analysis of news media content and what sort of associations are more prevalent, what sort of positive and negative associations are more prevalent with words that have political connotations. So I use very large lexicons of sentiment words. So basically lexicons that have a bunch of words categorized as positive, like intelligent, compassionate, sweet, things like that, and a bunch of negative, like words tagged as negative, like hateful, stupid, etc. And then I measure how often these terms are associated with terms with political connotations, such as conservatives, liberals, Republicans, and Democrats. And what I found is, I mean, to a certain extent is to be expected, but there was this very large correlation between this measurement and people's perceptions of media bias. So left-leaning news media, they tend to associate negative words with conservatives and with Republicans, and positive words with liberals and Democrats. And in right-wing media is the opposite. Like, for example, if you look at Fox News, they tend to associate negative words with liberals and Democrats. But there's something I have to say about this figure because it can be a bit misleading. It could appear here as if these sort of associations are more stronger in the left-leaning media than in the right-leaning media, and that could well be the case, but it is not necessarily so. It's not necessarily so because there is a big confounding factor here, which is that right-leaning news media massively uses content from news wires agencies. So, for example, if you look at Fox News, like a huge percentage of their content is straight wires from Associated Press, which has a slight tendency to associate negative words with conservatives and Republicans. So I think that creates a big confound. And also, it could be argued that this is not necessarily bias. It could just be that conservatives tend to more often use negative words because they have perhaps a negativity bias or something like that. And that's why you see these applications. That could well be the case, but still, I found an R square of like this very large correlation between these measurements and human perceptions of media bias. It was like well above 0.7.
That's very high for social science. Yeah. One thing that I'm noticing in these graphs, and I think I've got this right, is that for the left-leaning outlets, there's greater separation in the space between the positive and negatively valenced words than there is in the right-leaning outlets.
But again, this could be this could be basically a confound of like this asymmetry that you see in Associated Press and Reuters, which are massively used by all these right-leaning outlets.
Right. So it's that phenomenon that you'd already discussed.
Yeah, or it could also be some sort of negativity bias or propensity of conservatives to focus on negative stuff. It's not necessarily that they are just trashing conservatives or liberals. But again, then it's striking this above 0.7 correlation between human perceptions of media bias and these measurements. So I'll leave it here.
So David, does that bring us into your work about negativity and emotionality in general in US media?
Let's talk about that. Do you want to talk about COVID?
Sure.
You just done this work really recently on COVID, have you? I just saw it on your Twitter.
That was like about a year ago.
Oh, was it? Okay, sorry. I just saw it on your social media, but go ahead.
I know that was something else.
Okay.
Yeah, this was an analysis I did about something quite striking, which was, COVID pandemic, millions of people dead, our lives completely disrupted. And there were basically two hypotheses about where this virus came from. There was the zoonotic hypothesis that it came from nature, etc. And there was the hypothesis that this somehow escaped from a lab. And the COVID pandemic sort of, people started to realize the severity of it around March 2020. And at the time in news media, March of 2020, there was a lot of talk about the natural zoonotic hypothesis, the natural emergence hypothesis. So pangolins, bad viruses, civets, etc., wet markets, etc. So you see all these, like this chatter in news media. But very, very little attention to the hypothesis of a lab leak, a lab accident, a labscape, a laboratory origin. No mention of the fact that the Wuhan Institute of Virology was engaging in gain-of-function research at the time. No mention of like a very interesting biological marker in this SARS-CoV-19, the furin cleavage site that makes the virus more likely to infect human cells. Even the fact that there was a grant at the Wuhan Institute, like researchers from that lab apply for a DARPA grant for inserting a furin cleavage site in a coronavirus to make it to investigate how to make it more effective.
In fact, my recollection of that time is that the lab leak discourse was widely condemned as a conspiracy theory at that point.
Yeah, I think that was the problem. The problem was that Trump immediately claimed that this was a lab leak without providing any evidence. And a lot of news media outlets hated Trump. And I think that hypothesis became toxic by us. But it's still quite remarkable, right? Like an event that kills millions of people. Like the big priority should be, how do we avoid something like this catastrophe happening again?
So if it had leaked from a lab, we'd really want to know, wouldn't we?
Yeah, and one perfectly legitimate hypothesis for almost 1.5 years was completely ignored. And then something strange happened. Around May or June of 2021, the media finally started to talk about this. They finally started to mention that the closest genetic virus to SARS-CoV-19, which is called RITG13, was actually sequenced and it was located in the Wuhan Institute of Virology. It had been collected in caves thousands of kilometers away in Wuhan province, brought back to the institute, sequenced there, and that's the closest genetic sequence to SARS-CoV-19. And suddenly they started to talk about that. So I wonder why, this sudden switch. So I look at this media chatter on a daily basis during 2021. And I mark here several relevant events around the time. So when the World Health Organization commissioned to investigate the origins of the virus visited China, the Wuhan Institute of Virology, when they published the report, and you see a bit of chatter, but not much about these terms, like the fact that they were doing gain-of-function research, the possibility of a lab leak, etc. And it's only in May 6th that they start to talk about this. And this was one day after the publication of an extraordinary essay by a former, I think, Science or Nature editor, Nicholas Wade, which he provided a lot of circumstantial evidence suggesting that the lab leak hypothesis was a legitimate hypothesis that deserved serious investigation and consideration. And I mean, again, this is observational research. It's impossible to prove causality, but I think that the temporal coincidence is striking.
Yes.
Yeah, I remember that Nicholas Wade. I thought he previously worked for the New York Times, actually, as a science
He was
journalist.
also the science editor. He was a science editor for the New York Times, but I think also for one of the major
Oh, right, okay.
journals, either
Yeah.
Science or Nature. I forgot.
Well, we can link that article at the when we put this up on YouTube, because I think it's a really good
Yeah, it
one
was
to read
truly
also for those terms you were using earlier, like furin cleavage sites.
Yeah, it was truly extraordinary how
Yeah.
well written that was, and he was humble. He was not saying, no one can say this is what happens, but he was just saying, this hypothesis deserves serious consideration. And in fact, a few weeks later, Joe Biden ordered to many of his intelligence agencies like a serious investigation of what had happened, and the results of those investigations were inconclusive. But yeah, I mean, at least the hypothesis should be considered seriously. And yeah, if you want now, I can move to this probably the most sophisticated methodology that I have used in the past few years to analyze textual content, which is the usage of machine learning models to analyze the sentiment and emotion of text.
David, can I just say one final thing about the work you've done on COVID? Because I think this is really important, because this is really the reason we set up this podcast, is because we wanted to, remind people of the importance of free speech and open discussions of things. And when you suppress speech, two things tend to happen. One is that you get worse answers. You get worse discussions. We don't know what really happened, where COVID really came from, but it stands to reason that we're going to get better explanations out there. We're going to have a better debate if everybody can participate. And the other thing that happens when you suppress it is that certain people who are effectively doing nothing wrong and who are trying to contribute sensibly, they get their views shot down and they get cast off social media and things like that. And that also seems a shame. I mean, some people can make mistakes, and people can say things are wrong, but it doesn't mean that we should shut them down. Anyway, that's a little sermon there for the Free Kiwis, or our major theme. So please go on.
I agree 100%, and also there is it's catastrophic for society, because I mean, as I said, probably we don't want this to happen again, right? It has, like, I don't know, like how many millions of people have died because this horrible virus, but most people would agree that we don't want this to happen again. And one of the best ways of preventing this happening away again is understanding how it happened, so we can prevent it. Anyways, so yeah, this is one of the most sophisticated techniques I have used to analyze textual content. And for those who are not familiar with it, a machine learning model, it's actually a mathematical formula, a huge mathematical formula with millions of parameters. But you can basically give these models an input sentence that perhaps has some positive connotations, like today is a beautiful day, and the models recognize this positive connotation and label or tag that sentence as having positive sentiment. That's what a machine learning model fine-tuned for sentiment analysis does. And
so have you trained it using the emotional valence of individual words for it to do that?
Yeah. For this case, the sentiment. I'll talk about emotional balance later. But for this case, the sentiment. So you train it with tens of thousands of sentences that have been labeled by humans.
Yes.
Right, because you want the machine learning model to mimic human perceptions, right? So you ask, hundreds of humans to label thousands of sentences as positive or negative, and then you train the model with that data, and the model is able to learn how to tag, how to label sentences in a way that overlaps substantially with humans. So, like the sentence, a terrible traffic accident, most humans would agree that this has negative connotations, and a properly trained machine learning model optimized for sentiment analysis would agree and would label this as negative. So what I did with one of these state-of-the-art machine learning models, a transformer architecture, was to analyze 23 million news media headlines published over the last 20 years and tag the sentiment and over time, so longitudinally, to see how the sentiment is oscillating over time. And what I found is that the sentiment of headlines has been becoming more negative over time. So if you look at here in the y-axis, -1 would be maximum negativity, 1 would be maximum positivity, 0 is around neutral. And what we can see is that since the year 2000, the sentiment, the negativity of headlines has increased.
Yeah.
And
I don't know too much about how the scale works, but it doesn't necessarily look like a massive effect if it varies between 1 and -1. We're talking about a decline from a little below 0.1 down to about -0.15.
I mean, that's quite substantial, right? That's, I don't know, like 15% of the range.
Right. About,
Yes,
yeah.
it's quite
Yeah.
substantial. And I mean, at the extremes, you only have like super extreme things, right? Like, I'm super excited today. I mean,
Right. Yes.
we don't talk like that most often. Anyways, so when I control for the ideological orientation of news media, what I found is that right-leaning news media over the studied time period tends to use more negative headlines than left-leaning news media. So here in blue, you see the aggregation of headlines from left-leaning news media, and in red, you see the sentiment of right-leaning news media.
Yeah.
And you see that consistently, the right-leaning news media, they tend to use more negative language over time.
Whereas the centrist news outlets use less negative language than both left and right.
Yeah, but I worry that the centrist outlets, the sample size, is very little. There's just a few of them. I obviously I didn't create these labels myself. I use an external set, to avoid, like my own biases and things like that. And this is called the all size media bias chart. This is an organization that uses human ratings, like tens of thousands of human votes, to determine the biases, the political biases of news media. And unfortunately, at the time, 2019, there were very few news outlets classified as centrist.
I see. Yeah. Even so, if I'm not wrong, the vertical bars denote error in the data. And you have got, in fact, especially towards the end of the time course, a clearer separation between the centrists and both left and right than of left and right from one another.
Yeah. So yeah, and the same thing that you can do for sentiment, you can do it for for emotion. So you can fine-tune one of these models to label, instead of the sentiment, positive or negative, the emotion. So you can give it a sentence or a headline, such as "the president was outraged with the news," and the model detects that this has something to do with anger. Or a different headline might get classified as expressing joy or fear or sadness or neutrality, which perhaps is what you want most of the time for news media headlines.
Yeah.
And when I did this analysis for emotion of the same set of 23 million headlines, I think the most striking results were that the anger payload of headlines has been increasing, and also the fear that headlines convey. And there's this very substantial decrease in the prevalence of emotionally neutral headlines. So, for example, in the year 2000, 70% of all headlines published were classified as neutral, while more recently is less than 50%. And
What's going on with
again,
joy? Joy was a bit of a surprise. It rises and then it falls. But
yeah, well, but the scale of the y-axis is different. So this
okay,
increase is only like 2 percentage points. It's not that substantial.
all right.
You So yeah, and when I control for the ideological leanings of news media, I could see that the right-leaning news media, they tend to use headlines that express anger more often than left-leaning news media. And the decrease in emotionally neutral headlines is happening all over the media, centrist, left-leaning, and right-leaning news media, and increasing fear as well.
And some of the other negative words are more evenly shared by both sides.
Yeah, but again, like the other ones, as I said, like if you look at the Y scale here, it's very marginal changes,
Yeah.
the proportion of headlines. I think the important ones are anger, fear, and neutral.
Yes.
And yeah, the obvious question is why this is happening. Again, it's easy to blame social media post 2010, the like, the retweet buttons. Yeah, very difficult to know what's going on. I personally, like my opinion, this is not a scientific analysis. My opinion is that the media, it's in a very difficult situation. Post 2008, revenues were collapsing. There was this technology in social media and that allow news media to monitor the virality of the articles, how popular they get. They have these terrible financial incentives to maximize click-through ratios.
Yeah.
And it is well known that people are more likely to click on a headline that is emotionally salient.
Yeah. We've interviewed on
this incentive.
We have in the past interviewed on Free Kiwis Carl Dufresne, who was a editor of the Wellington newspaper a few decades ago. It was called the Dominion at the time. Now it's the Dominion Post. But he commented that the journalistic profession has changed markedly over the decades from one that has a very much a kind of neutral stance on issues, whereby editors would very carefully monitor what was going into a paper in terms of its any sense of bias and have reporters redo their work if it wasn't sufficiently neutral. And he thinks all of that is now dissipated and really journalists editorialize quite freely in their work, and so it's much more prone to bias than it was back then, and that may be associated with the use of less neutral language.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's difficult to know for sure, but definitely, I mean, I think I trust these models. Their performance overlaps with human ratings.
Yes. Yeah.
They perform at a similar level to how humans perform, and I think we can be pretty certain that news media headlines are becoming more negative and more emotional over time. And then the obvious question is, what is the effect, if at all, of this on the psyches or psychological well-being of people?
Yeah,
question for other people to answer.
it just struck me when you did this presentation today, David, that so in this most recent work you find that it's the right-wing news media that are using these terms which have more of a negative payload, and yet in the early stuff you were presenting to us, a lot of the terms like racism, sexism, transphobic, all that, they were associated more with the social justice discourse, which is something from the left. So is it the case that this new algorithm is kind of missing that? Because it sounds to me like terms like racist and sexist are quite angry words.
Yeah.
So it must be the right-wing media are using different words than that sound angry, right?
Yeah, but I mean, remember that the right-wing media is also using these terms a lot. It's a bit less than the left-leaning media, but there's also many ways for being negative, right? They can trust Barack Obama, the Democrats, things like that. So I think there's many ways of being negative beyond.
But I suppose when we put it all together, what we see is an emerging picture of more polarization, which does accord with some of the other data from social science that we know about. And, you're asking what is the question, what is the effect psychologically on people? We might think that it is actually a bit of a feedback loop, that because of course journalists are people like everybody else, and they're all susceptible to the same influences. And if we have all of these factors, including the Trump phenomenon, including social media, including the way the press uses language, all playing out together, it may become disturbingly a self-sustaining loop.
Yeah, I mean, David Brooks at the New York Times talked about this paper, and he said that he related this to increasing levels of unhappiness that have been documented all over the world.
Yes, that's right too.
Case.
Yeah.
Social media probably has played a very toxic role post 2010. Like the obsession with metrics to maximize click-through ratios, to spread all the financial incentives. I suspect that also played a role. And whether this is having an impact on people, that remains to be seen, because people could also be getting desensitized to it. But again, other people should look into this carefully.
Yeah, so the explanation I was putting forward before, that maybe these terms, well, especially the terms we were looking at the beginning of this interview, that they actually increase because people are actually just looking at the real world and finding lots of sexism and racism. I want to just go back to that, because it seems to me when we looked at the graph you had of academic literature over the long term and how often they're using terms like racist and sexist, it's very striking that terms like racist are used significantly more, much, much more nowadays than, for example, during the Second World War. And then I don't know the literature very well, but to the extent that I know there's a literature on just surveying people's attitudes and views about race and things like that. In general, at least in the developed West, racism and sexism have declined. So if you ask people questions like, would you mind your daughter marrying a person of a different race, or would you mind your neighbor being a person of a different race? People say no to that a lot more frequently over the decades. So it seems like, just as all of our objective evidence for racism shows that's declining, there's this huge spike in the language of racism and the use of these terms in academic literature.
Yeah, I mean, many academics would counter-argue that there's no less racism or sexism, is just that it's becoming less overt because people have learned to hide it, but it's still there, lurking in the background. That's what some academics would say to answer about that. It's also like many of these concepts, as we show in the for gender prejudice before the 1970s, no one was talking about that in the academic literature. It was probably a construct. Perhaps they used different terms, or it was not, or people could not even conceive.
Yeah, I mean that one actually strikes me as a case where, society probably was quite sexist before that, and it probably was the case that people just didn't even think about it. And so there, I think we can see that as a kind of awakening. I'm just less convinced in the case of racism, for example, where the 1940s, obviously there was this sort of probably the world's greatest sort of genocide happening in Nazi Germany, and the extent to which people were discussing racism was less then than it is now, and that to me that suggests that when people the huge proliferation of terms to do with racism now doesn't necessarily reflect any reality.
And in fact, with both racism and sexism, I mean, we've seen this massive spike since 2010. Well, all of the kind of legally enforced racism and sexism was gone decades before that. We can see in objective data that women and people of color and so on have much more access to institutions, to employment, and so on over time. So again, all the objective measures seem to fly in the face of the idea that sexism and racism are just as bad as ever, even if they are covert. It just doesn't seem a very, and from a scientific perspective, if it's covert, it's not really testable. So how would we know?
I mean, I will not speak beyond the data. All I will say is that definitely, for sure, it is well documented, I think, that the media is talking about this sort of different prejudice types much more.
Yeah, well, it's very clear from your work. Yeah.
And yeah.
Okay, David, that was absolutely fantastic. I mean, I knew some of your work before, but I think you presented it really, really clearly. So it's good to have the opportunity of getting more of it out there. And I should say that if people want to read more about your work, I mean, you're also very good at putting it out there at different levels of detail. So I would suggest people have a look at your Twitter, where you put lots of nice graphs. Then at your Substack, where you kind of have really nice introductory articles, including lots of graphs of what you've done. And then finally, for people who like or are interested in the technical details of what you've been doing in terms of machine learning, we'll put some links to your actual academic articles as well.
Thank you, James.
Yeah, brilliant work, David, and thank you very much for sharing it with us today.
Thank you to you guys.